A flight attendant demanded a black CEO kneel and apologize, but he turned the tables, making the attendant kneel instead in front of 189 witnesses and 42 phone cameras. He told the black CEO to kneel and apologize, thinking he could assert control. He didn't realize the CEO had already turned the cabin into a courtroom. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always crumbles under true authority. The words hadn't even settled into silence when the cabin tilted into tension. Maybe if you'd learned to sit proper, you wouldn't need one, the flight attendant said, half smirking as he dangled the unused seatbelt extension just out of reach. His name tag read Ryvan Dorn, and his tone wasn't professional. It was poisoned with mock amusement, his voice carrying just loud enough for others nearby to hear. Several passengers in first class stiffened. Some glanced over, unsure whether they had just misheard. Darnell Voss didn't move immediately. He simply blinked once and looked up slowly from the leather-bound journal resting across his lap. His right wrist was still linked to a thin, brushed steel handcuff, which secured his briefcase like a shadow. It hadn't drawn attention until now, but Ryvan had noticed, not with curiosity, but with something colder, judgment. Darnell had boarded quietly, dressed in a sharply tailored navy suit, his shoulders square, his posture composed despite the slight shift in his lower spine, residual from an old L4, L5 disc procedure. The kind of injury that never truly healed, only tolerated. He had nodded politely to the gate agent, offered a quiet thank you to the junior crew member who'd greeted him at the door, and then took his seat in 1A without fanfare, without expectation. That was how he preferred it. Unseen if possible, unbothered at the very least. But Ryvan had made a decision before Darnell even sat down, that this was no VIP, no executive, no one worth honoring. Just another black man asking for extra accommodation. "Excuse me?" Darnell asked, not with surprise, but with measured calm. "I said," Ryvan repeated louder, "maybe if you'd learned to sit proper, you wouldn't need one." This time, the pause that followed was heavier. The line, sharp and condescending, dropped into the air like a wet coat thrown on a flame. And the flame hissed, but it did not flare yet. Darnell glanced at the extension, still hovering in Ryvan's hand like a prop in some absurd play. "I had spinal surgery 3 years ago," he replied, his voice low but unwavering. "That extension ensures I don't rupture a disc when the belt locks. It's a medical necessity, not a preference." Ryvan raised an eyebrow and gave a little theatrical shrug. "Sure it is." Then, with a chuckle, something cruel in its casualness, he added, "If you want help, you kneel and apologize for causing delay." For a heartbeat, the cabin stopped breathing. Even the whir of the air vents seemed to fade into the background. Two businessmen in 1C and 2A turned, their phones suddenly tilted ever so slightly toward the scene. A younger man across the aisle started recording with a subtle flick of his thumb. And from the back, a flight attendant trainee glanced toward the galley with wide eyes, unsure whether to step in or stay out. Darnell didn't blink. He didn't sigh. Instead, he closed the leather journal carefully, like one would close the cover of a sacred text. Then he unbuttoned his jacket with the precision of a man preparing for something inevitable, not a fight, but a moment. "Son," he said to his assistant, seated silently in 1B, "hold this." He handed over the journal without looking away from Ryvan. Then he stood. He rose with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to stay composed in rooms designed to unsettle him. Each motion was practiced, the jacket slipping off his shoulders, folded over his arm, the click of the cuff being detached from the briefcase, all fluid and quiet like a storm preparing far from shore. Ryvan took a step back, not out of fear, yet but confusion. The script wasn't playing out as expected. Darnell turned toward the rest of the cabin for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "I apologize for the disruption." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried like steel beneath velvet. "But I believe this gentleman," he gestured toward Ryvan without ever looking at him, "has mistaken me for someone who doesn't belong here." The cameras came up faster now. Ryvan laughed again, but this time it cracked. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded. the forced bravado now struggling to find purchase. Darnell met his eyes. "I'm the majority shareholder of Alteris Aviation's parent fund," he said evenly. "And you just insulted the man who signs the checks that write your training manual." Riven's face paled. Around the cabin, the shift was seismic. Passengers sat straighter, some whispering, others filming with widened eyes. The line between crew and customer had vanished. This wasn't a complaint anymore. This was a confrontation. "You're bluffing," Riven muttered. Darnell slowly sat back down, his movements controlled. "I've spent the last 15 years making sure people don't have to kneel to be treated with basic dignity," he said, voice tightening just slightly now. "But if you'd like to find out whether I'm bluffing, keep going." One of the junior attendants disappeared toward the cockpit. Another stood frozen at the curtain, half in the galley, half out, watching with the uneasy expression of someone realizing a mistake had been made on their watch. Darnell opened his briefcase. Inside was a single folder marked with a red tab. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his hands calmly on his knees, and met Riven's faltering gaze with a kind of stillness that came not from anger, but from readiness. "You want help," Darnell repeated, voice just above a whisper. "You said I should kneel and apologize. But I think it's time you learned who you're speaking to." A few rows back, a middle-aged man whispered, "He just told the wrong man to kneel." And in that instant, everyone knew it wasn't the passenger who was in trouble anymore. It was the airline. "You just told the wrong man to kneel. Who do you think you are?" Riven Dorn's voice sliced through the cabin like a bitter wind. His smirk stretched too wide, riding the laughter that followed, sharp and insincere. He stood square in the aisle now, one hand gripping the overhead bin as if it gave him authority, the other pointing lazily at the seated man in 1A. Darnell Voss didn't blink. He rose from his seat with a deliberate stillness, every movement quiet, controlled, as if the space around him had shifted into a different gravity. His assistant, seated nearby, subtly slid the briefcase closer with a foot, though his eyes never left the scene. "I'm the majority shareholder of Alteris Aviation's parent fund," Darnell said, his tone calm, but crystalline in its precision, "and you just insulted the man who signs the checks that write your training manual." A ripple of whispers passed through the front cabin like static. Seat backs creaked as passengers leaned forward. Two phones came up slowly from row 3 and 5, uncertain but recording. Riven's laughter returned, louder this time, forced and theatrical. "All right," he chuckled, hands raised like he was shrugging off an awkward moment. "Let's not make this into some drama. I was joking." Darnell's expression remained unchanged. "I'd like to speak with the captain," he said simply. "No need for that," Riven replied quickly, glancing toward the galley. "Captain's busy. I'll ask again," Darnell said, his eyes now locked onto Riven's with unshakable calm. "Call the captain." Riven stepped closer, the smile gone now, voice lowered into a condescending murmur. "You think your money changes protocol?" Darnell didn't answer with words. He turned slightly, his right hand reaching down with fluid confidence to the silver cuff linking him to the briefcase. A soft click echoed as he released the lock. The movement wasn't fast, but it was deliberate, like someone trained not to waste motion. He knelt, not in submission, but with tactical intent, and opened a slim side pocket. From within, he pulled a thin, cream-colored folder marked with a red seal and passed it backward to a man seated 2 rows behind. "Would you mind reading that aloud?" The man, a white-collared, middle-aged passenger in 3A, blinked surprised. He accepted the folder slowly, glancing between Darnell and Riven. Sure." He opened it, adjusted his reading glasses, and began. "This is a shareholder's authorization for real-time corporate audit of in-flight operations," he read. His voice was loud enough to carry to the mid-cabin. Heads turned. Even one of the junior attendants near the beverage cart paused mid-pour. The man swallowed and continued. "Pursuant to standing authority under Section 4.7b of Crichton Holdings' Operational Oversight Charter, audit rights may be executed at will by primary shareholder Darnell Voss." A breathless silence fell over the aisle. Riven's jaw twitched. His fingers curled against the edge of the service card. His posture was no longer smug, but tight, defensive. Darnell finally nodded once. "You asked who I am," he said, not to boast, but to confirm. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm the man who audits everything you just did." Captain Marin Rule stepped into the cabin with the practiced authority of a man used to controlling tense airspace, not public scandal. But even before he fully entered, the air told him everything. Silence gripped the passengers. Dozens of phones were raised and filming, and one man, calm, centered, composed, stood with a file in one hand and a wrist no longer tethered to the briefcase, now resting at his feet. That man was Darnell Voss. Marin's eyes scanned the scene. His instincts recognized conflict instantly, but this wasn't a shouting match or a drunken passenger. It was something colder, something controlled. Ryvan Dorn, the lead flight attendant, was standing rigid near the forward galley, clearly unsettled. And there in seat 1A, Darnell offered a courteous nod as if they were in a boardroom, not a pressurized aircraft. "I'd like this flight delayed 10 minutes, Darnell said with unshakable calm. "Internal compliance." The words landed like a legal strike. Marin blinked, caught off guard by how effortlessly they were spoken, as if the request were not a suggestion but a certainty. Ryvan scoffed audibly and stepped forward, voice rising. "Captain, this is absurd. He's exaggerating, playing the victim card to delay our timeline." Marin turned, unsure where to look first, at the passengers capturing every word or at the file in Darnell's hand that radiated the weight of authority. But Darnell didn't wait for debate. He raised his wrist, tapped a button on the side of his watch, and calmly declared, "Authorization, Kellis Delta. Begin live record." A sterile voice replied from the device almost immediately. "Confirmed. Timestamp, 8:32. Crichton Systems flight audit initiated." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The sound of the confirmation, neutral, irrefutable, felt like the shifting of a tectonic plate under everyone's feet. Marin stiffened. His fingers flexed at his sides, eyes now locked on the man in seat 1A. Darnell let the silence stretch, then turned to Ryvan with quiet intensity. "You told me to kneel and apologize," he said. "But what you didn't realize is this seat was mine long before I boarded." Ryvan took a step back, his mouth opening but no sound emerging. He had lost the room. The cameras, once watching a minor scuffle, were now witnessing a reckoning. Just then, a man in the second row of business class slowly rose. His suit was simple, not showy, gray with a deep blue pocket square, but his presence was undeniable. He held a leather card case and spoke with the low authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything. "I can confirm his authority," the man said. "My name is Aaron Kale. I'm on the board of Crichton Systems." The moment crystallized. Marin looked from Aaron to Darnell, then back to Ryvan. The attendant's defiance, once puffed up by assumed status, now deflated completely. His hands dropped to his sides. Sweat dotted his temples. Darnell did not gloat. His expression remained neutral, not cold, but focused. He was not here to win an argument. He was here to expose something. In the background, one of the junior attendants who had initially summoned the captain now fidgeted near the service station, clearly trying to disappear. Another passenger whispered, "Did he really tell that man to kneel?" Someone else nodded. "I got on camera." Every word, foreshadowing, hung thick in the cabin air. This wasn't just about one incident. The tone, the evidence, the composure, it hinted at something larger, something planned. A trap had been laid, but it wasn't for Darnell. It was for anyone who assumed he'd stay silent. Marin exhaled slowly. He understood now that this wasn't a moment to defuse. It was a moment to witness and document. "Understood," the captain said, his voice low. "We'll delay departure by 10 minutes, pending review." He glanced toward the cockpit, then back at the sea of passengers, now transfixed. "Until further notice, this cabin is under audit." Phones continued to film, and at the center of it all stood Darnell Voss, immovable as stone. "You told me to kneel and apologize," he repeated, voice steady, gaze unshaken. "But what you didn't realize is this seat was mine long before I boarded." "No," Aaron Kale said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the cabin like a wire pulled taut. This flight is not continuing until protocol is followed to the letter. He stood squarely in the aisle, holding up a tablet, displaying a compliance clause, his ID badge now visibly pinned to his lapel. You are now subject to immediate federal protocol review. Ryvan Dorn scoffed, his face flushed with frustration as passengers leaned forward in their seats. This is corporate theater, he muttered, glancing back toward the galley where two junior crew members watched in stunned silence. Aaron didn't flinch. I've already contacted a compliance officer at the terminal, he said. If you obstruct any part of this process, security will meet you on the jet bridge. He tapped the side of his earpiece. They're listening right now. The cabin grew colder, not physically, but atmospherically. The kind of quiet that vibrated just under the skin. A few passengers clutched their armrests, as if bracing for turbulence that hadn't yet arrived. Darnell Voss remained seated in 1A, one leg crossed calmly over the other, his journal closed and placed neatly beside him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was almost a whisper, but it carried. I didn't come here to argue, he said, eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. I came here to prove that silence is how this behavior survives. His words didn't rise in pitch, but their weight dropped like a stone in water. Suddenly, the voice of an older man broke the moment. From row 6C, a passenger with a pilot's posture and a head full of gray hair stood up slowly. I'm a retired flight instructor, he said, and I've seen that man, your attendant, use the same humiliation tactic before. A woman with leg paralysis. He made her prove she needed help by crawling halfway to the restroom. Ryvan flinched. The older man added, I filed a complaint. It went nowhere. That opened the door. Row 9A. A man in a suit raised his hand. He made me explain my PTSD to the entire row before giving me water. Row 14F. He told my brother to beg for a blanket during a night flight. My brother's autistic. Each voice chipped away at the illusion that Ryvan had acted alone or in ignorance. And with every voice, Ryvan's posture shrank just a little more. He looked around the cabin like a man searching for a hole in the wall. But there was none. He turned sharply, attempting to retreat toward the cockpit, but Captain Marin Rule had already stepped out. The door clicked shut behind him with audible finality. You're not going anywhere, the captain said, blocking the aisle. His stance was calm, but his tone held a finality that stripped away any sense of negotiation. No one gets past me now. Ryvan hesitated, chest heaving as he looked from the captain to the legal officer, to the sea of phones recording every flinch of his expression. That's when Darnell moved again. He stood up, slow and deliberate, and reached into his leather briefcase. No hitty, no threat, just precision. From inside, he removed a slim folder-bound and Crichton Systems seal and passed it without a word to Aaron. The board advisor accepted it, opening to a marked tab. His brows lifted as he read silently. Then his voice rang clear for all to hear. Page 6, he announced, holding the document upright for any nearby passenger to see. Effective immediately, the acting shareholder has full authority to suspend any employee in violation of passenger dignity clauses. Gasps flickered across the rows like sparks from a wire. Darnell stepped closer to Ryvan, his expression unreadable but steady. This wasn't about a seatbelt extension, he said. It never was. It was about whether people like you get to decide who's worth respecting at 38,000 feet. Ryvan's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked to the captain, then to Aaron, then to the cameras that now formed a mosaic of red recording dots. Aaron folded the document back into its cover. His voice was steady. You've just been suspended, Mr. Dorn. The sound of 189 hands clapping echoed like a judgment handed down from the sky itself. It wasn't a roar of revenge. It was something purer, recognition of a shift. For once, authority wasn't used to crush someone, it was used to lift something bigger. In the aisle, Ryvan Dorn stood frozen. His arms hung at his sides, fists clenched, jaw tight with disbelief. His mind raced, scrambling for a way to rewrite the moment, to reclaim some dignity. But the applause wasn't for him. It never had been. Darnell Voss didn't move at first. He simply watched. His gaze swept the cabin, not for attention, but for confirmation. The moment had landed. People had heard. They had seen. Only then did he rise. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped out from his seat in 1A and turned to face the entire cabin. The sunlight filtering through the window didn't touch his face. It rested behind him like a shadow of something inevitable. "He told me to kneel," Darnell began, voice clear but not raised, "in front of you. Not just to shame me, but to shame what he didn't understand." His words sank into the hush. No one moved. Even the engines, idling outside, seemed quieter. Darnell's hand gestured lightly to his side, toward the seatbelt extension still resting and used. He mocked a condition that has never defined me, and I've spent my life ensuring that people, especially those overlooked, don't have to kneel to be heard. His voice never cracked, but something deeper was breaking open in the room. A silent agreement that cruelty disguised as protocol was no longer tolerable. Then came the turn. Darnell stepped toward Riven, not with rage, not even anger, but something more dangerous to injustice. Calm intent. He stopped just short of the man who had, moments ago, demanded submission. "Now you will kneel," Darnell said, steady as stone. "Not for me. For them. For everyone you ever humiliated and dismissed and forced to shrink." Riven's throat bobbed. "If you can't make me," he stammered, the defiance in his voice clashing with the tremor in his hands. His eyes flicked between Darnell and the aisle lined with phone cameras, 42 of them, lenses locked and blinking. Every second was being streamed, stored, immortalized. But it wasn't fear that made Riven hesitate. It was exposure. Aaron Kale stepped forward then, the board advisor's voice crisp with formality, but laced with a moral gravity that couldn't be ignored. Under Title 12 of In-Flight Conduct Regulation, he said, "You are now officially suspended pending investigation." He held up the signed document, embossed and stamped. "If you refuse to comply, you will be forcefully removed and federally charged under discrimination statutes filed during active flight." Riven's shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had fueled his cruelty moments ago drained from his body like a leaking valve. The cameras didn't blink. Neither did Darnell. The silence dragged just long enough to make everyone hold their breath. Then, slowly, knees trembling, Riven Dorn lowered himself. One leg, then the other. His palms hit the floor of the aisle to brace himself as he dropped into a kneeling position. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't brave. But it was undeniable. His head dipped, not from reverence, but from the weight of consequence. A low gasp passed through the cabin, followed by a collective intake of breath, as if the cabin itself was resetting. Darnell didn't gloat. He didn't even smirk. He simply stepped back, eyes locked on the man kneeling at his feet. "That's the cost of forcing someone else to bow," he said, each word deliberate, final. "Eventually, you bow to the truth." Security stood waiting on the jet bridge the moment Altair's Flight 901 taxied to the gate, but there were no cuffs, just protocol and pressure. The lead agent, a tall man in a Navy windbreaker marked terminal operations, stepped forward without a word. Riven Dorn was the first to exit, or rather, be escorted. His posture had shrunk to something almost brittle. Shoulders collapsed inward, as if carrying more than just a uniform. Shame, maybe, or the weight of realizing 189 strangers had watched him fall. The phones were still recording. Every step was immortalized. Every blink. Every breath that wasn't quite steady. Inside the aircraft, Darnell Voss remained in seat 1A. The screen on his watch blinked rhythmically. Audit recording, active. He didn't move, didn't look up. His briefcase sat unopened on his lap, hand resting over it like a vault seal. Captain Marin Rule reappeared in the aisle, clearing his throat softly as he approached. "Mr. Voss," he began, tone respectful but cautious, "I'd like to personally apologize for what happened back there. I wasn't aware." Darnell raised a hand slowly. "This isn't about me anymore," he said, voice calm but resolute. His eyes didn't leave the center line of the aisle. "It's about everyone who saw what just happened, and everyone who's endured it without cameras." The captain nodded. There was nothing else to say. Around them, The cabin buzzed quietly as passengers whispered, thumbs tapping furiously on phones. Videos had already begun spreading across social media. The tag hashtag Kneel for Truth gaining momentum before the plane had even refueled. There were angles from every row. Some included the initial insult. Others zoomed in on Riven's expression as he knelt. And then there were the reactions, silent tears, nods of approval, the kind of unspoken unity that formed when injustice was finally met with quiet resistance. But as Darnell adjusted his seatbelt, a faint vibration from his encrypted watch caught his attention. He tapped the side twice. A message appeared in bold text, stark against the black screen. Prepare for internal sabotage review. Crew logs show falsified protocol entries connected to Riven's ID. Darnell's jaw tightened. A seat creaked beside him. Aaron Kale, the board advisor who had earlier confirmed Darnell's authority, leaned in from 1B. He'd caught the flash of data on the watch. "What is it?" Aaron asked, his voice low. Darnell turned the screen toward him. Aaron's brows furrowed as he read, then again as he reread. "This wasn't spontaneous," he muttered. "Someone higher may have sanctioned that Neil stunt. Could have been a calculated provocation, a loyalty test, or worse, an entrapment attempt." Darnell didn't blink. His silence was deliberate. Then, without a word, he reached into the side pocket of his briefcase and pulled out a third folder, this one marked with a red diagonal slash and the words, Operation Silencer, Contingency File / In-Flight Variables. The title alone hit like static. "I had a feeling," Darnell murmured, opening it. His eyes scanned quickly, efficiently, pages filled with incident matrices, psychological trigger maps, and anonymized behavior audits. In one column, a phrase stood out: Kneeling Request Simulation, Tier 3 Escalation Strategy. A code next to it matched Riven's crew ID. Darnell's thumb hovered there a moment longer. Aaron leaned closer. "You think they knew who you were?" "I think," Darnell said slowly, "they hoped I'd forget who I was." The engine hum deepened as the plane prepared to taxi again. Outside the windows, lights moved along the tarmac like distant fireflies, routine motion against the weight of what had just occurred. But inside 1A, nothing felt routine. Not anymore. Darnell closed the folder, sealing it with a brass clip. His fingers lingered on the cover. For months, he had suspected subtle behavioral experiments were being conducted against specific passengers, testing emotional limits, probing reaction thresholds, especially among people like him. Those who looked powerful, those who weren't expected to stay silent. And now, confirmation was unfolding midair. He looked across the aisle at a man holding his sleeping child. Earlier, that child had cried when Riven raised his voice. Now, he slept peacefully, unaware that dignity had just been defended not with volume, but with precision. "They tried to bait me into losing control," Darnell said, more to himself than anyone. Aaron, watching him, asked softly, "What happens now?" Darnell tapped his watch once more, activating a new encryption log. The screen blinked. Recording transferred. Crichton Secure mainframe. He looked forward, but now they've lost the narrative. The wheels had barely touched the tarmac at Cresswind International when the door to Altera's Flight 901 opened and the cool, stiff air of ground protocol swept through the jet bridge. Waiting just beyond the threshold were 3 men in dark charcoal uniforms. Not security, not police, but internal affairs officers from Alteris Aviation, all carrying tablets and wearing clip badges that read Ethics Division. The passengers disembarked in a quiet stream, murmuring about what they'd witnessed midair. Darnell Voss remained seated until the last row cleared, his briefcase once again cuffed to his wrist, his leather-bound journal closed neatly beside him. As he stepped off the plane, the lead officer, a composed man named Director Lennox Harvin, extended his hand. "Mr. Voss, we won't waste your time. We're not here to question. We're here to cooperate." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice of words," he said, accepting the handshake firmly. "Why the sudden change in posture?" Lennox tilted his head toward a secured corridor. "Because it seems your instincts were right, and you weren't the only one keeping records." Inside a quiet investigation chamber just past Gate 17, The air was cooler, more sterile. Glass walls surrounded them, and a discreet camera blinked red in the corner, recording but not broadcasting. Lennox tapped his tablet and slid it toward Darnell. The screen displayed a series of internal communications, emails, voice memos, and digital logs. One memo stood out in bold lettering. Compliance Conditioning Group, Performance Field Test Protocol. Voss, Darnell, CEO, Crichton Systems. They had a file on me, Darnell said, more to himself than to anyone else. And they ran it mid-flight? Lennox nodded solemnly. We have confirmation from 2 whistleblowers within the Alteris executive branch. The group operates quietly, insulated from oversight. Their stated objective is, well, you can read it yourself. He tapped a line highlighted in yellow. Phase 1 stress triggers. Escalate subtle provocations against high-influence passengers, especially minority leaders, to measure thresholds of response. Objective. Collect behavior data for predictive discipline modeling. Darnell exhaled, his jaw tense. Psychological boundary stress testing, he muttered, recalling the exact phrase from the document. They're running boardroom games at 38,000 feet and using crew like Riven as tools, Lennox added. Though willing tools, in his case. Before Darnell could respond, there was a knock at the glass door. A young man entered, no badge, no tablet, just a gray jacket and hesitant eyes. He walked with slow purpose, the way someone does when they know their past might be rewritten or weaponized by a single sentence. Mr. Voss, he said quietly. My name's Jaron Bell. I used to be an attendant here. 3 months ago, I was assigned to Flight Alteris 617. You were on board. Darnell studied him. The name didn't ring a bell, but the sincerity in his voice held weight. I was ordered to provoke you, Jaron continued. Subtle stuff. Delays, passive aggression, questioning your upgrades, nothing overt. Just enough to frustrate. But I couldn't do it. I didn't follow the script. I treated you with respect. And, Darnell asked, I lost my position a week later. They cited protocol inconsistencies. But I knew exactly why. There was silence. Heavy. Then Darnell stood and extended his hand. Then you weren't part of the problem, he said, voice low, steady. You were a test they didn't count on. Jaron's grip was unsure, but his voice was firm. I never wanted recognition. I just couldn't keep quiet when I saw what happened today. Lennox cleared his throat. Mr. Voss, there's more. That child seated in 1B, his father has filed a complaint. Not about Riven, but about the trauma his son experienced watching you be treated that way. The boy apparently asked, why are they mean to him, Daddy? That line, it's already spreading online. It's becoming the symbol of this flight. Darnell's expression didn't change, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, grief, perhaps, or a quiet ache that no audit could erase. Of all the humiliations, all the betrayals, it was that whispered question from a child that struck the hardest. Not because it exposed weakness, but because it revealed how casually cruelty spreads, how easily children learn hierarchy from the aisles of a plane. He turned back to Jaron. Tell me, do you want to return to this airline? Jaron hesitated. Honestly, sir, only if it means changing it. Darnell nodded slowly, as if sealing something sacred in his mind. Then you're about to get it back. He smirked, confident in his demand, unaware that every one of the 189 witnesses and 42 phone cameras were silently documenting his humiliation. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always meets instant accountability, hit subscribe now, because justice never misses a single detail. Start the stream, Darnell Voss said flatly as the Crichton Systems board meeting came to order. No introductions. No varmopese. Just the truth, straight and unflinching. The faces on the screen flickered into focus. 19 men seated across cities and time zones, some in luxury offices, others dialing in from private jets and conference lounges. But all wore the same expression now. Tension. The headlines had hit within hours. Viral footage of a black CEO being told to kneel by a flight attendant had rocketed across the internet. But what none of them expected was what came next, the revelation of Operation Silencer. Gentlemen, Darnell began, his voice steady, controlled, but sharp enough to cut through the corporate varnish. You didn't just inherit a PR crisis. You inherited a culture you chose not to see. He stepped aside so the presentation could begin. On the large screen behind him, images cycled. The footage from Flight 901, Rivin Dorn's smirk, the command to kneel, Darnell's calmly executed audit, and finally, Dorn on his knees before a cabin full of silent, recording witnesses. The board members sat stiffly, watching what the world had already seen. But Darnell wasn't interested in theatrics. "I want you to look at page 1 of the packet you've received," he said. A moment passed as papers rustled. "That's a copy of the internal memo. Yes, the one referring to psychological boundary stress testing on minority executives. Sectioned under compliance enforcement pilots." Gasps, low and sharp, cut through the silence. One director, a wiry man named Halden Miles, muttered, "We approved no such program." "No," Darnell replied, stepping forward, "but you approved the discretionary research budget that funded it. You signed off on compliance innovation grants without reading what they were innovating. You trusted Rivin Dorn with behavioral discretion." He paused. This is what he did with it. Another board member, Arthur Kellen, leaned forward. "Is this real? I mean, these files, they're time-stamped, notarized, and chain-verified by our internal audit system. And they include logs of prior flights where similar tactics were attempted." Darnell cut in. "I have names. I have victims. And I have statement from 2 of your own shareholders who were on Flight 901 and didn't recognize me because, out of context, I was just another black man in 1A. That landed hard." Darnell locked eyes with the group. "That's the point. You didn't see me because you didn't expect me. That's how this happened. That's how it keeps happening." A moment of silence stretched, dense as gravity. Then board advisor Aaron Kale, seated near the center, spoke up. "So what do you want from us?" "Everything," Darnell replied. "Freeze all internal behavior modification programs. Suspend discretionary compliance training until full audit. Launch an immediate investigation into all crew flagged for misconduct. And from this day forward, any employee who participates in a dignity-violating protocol will be subject to shareholder suspension." Another voice chimed in. "This will leak." "It already has," Darnell said. "But the difference is we get to decide how it ends. With accountability or with collapse." The board wavered. Some looked pale, some defensive, but none could ignore the footage, the evidence, or the public fury already boiling. Then Arthur Kellen cleared his throat. "Let's vote." Darnell didn't blink. Each member cast their vote slowly, visibly burdened by the weight of what they now realized they had allowed. The count moved quickly, 5, 10, 15, 19. "All in favor," Arthur announced. "Motion passes. 19-0. A heavy silence settled again. "It's not just a PR crisis anymore," one shareholder whispered, barely loud enough for the mic to pick it up. "It's a reckoning." The microphones clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us." Darnell Voss didn't smile as he stepped into the light. He didn't need to. The weight of the past week was already written on the faces in the crowd. Reporters with sharpened pens, airline executives pretending not to sweat, and 2 men standing just behind him. One a retired air marshal, the other a former schoolteacher. They had both been passengers on Altair's Flight 901. They had both filmed what the world now knew as the Neil incident. And now, they stood at his side, not as witnesses, but as reformers. 7 days ago, Darnell began, his voice even, I boarded a plane expecting silence. Not from others, but from myself. I had no intention of speaking that day. I was simply going to fly. His hand rested briefly on the podium before he continued. But when you're told to kneel for dignity you already possess, silence is no longer an option. Behind him, a towering screen flickered to life, displaying a header in bold letters. The Passenger Dignity Charter. Below it, a single line glowed. Because respect shouldn't need a seat assignment. The charter you see behind me, Darnell explained, is not a mission statement. It's not a suggestion. It is now a legally binding code of conduct for all Altair's aviation employees, ground, cabin, and executive alike. Gasps and murmurs rolled through the press section. Cameras clicked. One reporter whispered, legally binding, to a colleague. But Darnell wasn't done. It will be audited quarterly by a third-party oversight council. Not one hired by the airline. Not one filtered through legal jargon. But one led by people who've sat where most executives never will. In seat 29B, in row 41, beside crying children or aching parents or veterans with braces on their backs. He paused, then turned halfway toward the two men standing behind him. These two, he said, gesturing, have agreed to oversee our staff retraining program. Not because they needed a job, but because they lived through what silence allowed. The teacher stepped forward first, gray at the temples, steady in his stance. I was on that flight, he said, and I've taught students for 30 years how to treat people with dignity. But I never imagined I'd see someone need to teach that lesson at 38,000 feet. Next, the retired air marshal, tall and broad-shouldered, took the mic. My job was always to protect people quietly. But that day, it was a man and one who protected all of us. The room fell quiet. Then came the twist Darnell had kept hidden until now. He stepped back up, holding a sealed envelope in his hand. There's one more thing, he said. This charter, this framework, it won't be enforced by lawyers. It won't be buried in HR paperwork or watered down in policy lingo. He opened the envelope and pulled out a copy of the agreement, signed, sealed, notarized. It will be enforced by those who've lived it. He handed the papers to the teacher and the marshal. The symbolism was undeniable, survivors holding the system that once failed them. Gasps echoed again as names began to appear on a side panel beside the screen. A list of suspended crew, including Ryven Dorn and 4 others tied to the internal behavior manipulation program. Their roles, flight histories, and compliance violations flicked across the display. But Darnell didn't say a word about them. He didn't even look. A reporter raised his hand. Mr. Voss, why not name the others aloud? Don't they deserve public accountability? Darnell's answer was calm and deliberate. This isn't about vengeance. It's about vision. Another question flew in. Do you feel vindicated? He looked out over the crowd, past the press, past the shareholders seated silently in the second row, past even the executives who had once doubted him. Ask the 42 cameras, he said, his voice low but clear. They saw everything I didn't need to say. The moment Darnell tapped the encrypted folder marked confidential, behavioral conditioning, he set into motion something far larger than Alteris Aviation could contain. Within days of his press conference, headlines shifted from viral justice to national reckoning. But Darnell didn't linger in the limelight. He had already moved to the next step, repairing what had quietly been broken long before a seatbelt extension ever sparked confrontation. Inside Crichton Systems, his office lights burned long past midnight. The boardroom was dark, save for the glow of a single terminal streaming internal compliance updates from across the airline industry. Terms like in-seat authority testing and assertive psychological boundaries surfaced again and again in the manuals of rival carriers. Darnell read each one silently, jaw set, eyes narrowing with every line that confirmed what he had long suspected. Ryven Dorn's humiliation tactics were not isolated. They were part of a larger, normalized system. A notification blinked across the corner of his screen. Message received from Department of Ethical Aviation Practices. He opened it, scanning the invitation quickly. They wanted him to join their advisory board. It was the kind of request that could reshape policy at the national level. But Darnell paused, not from pride, but principle. He couldn't accept, not yet. Not until he made something right. The next morning, Darnell rerouted his schedule without notifying media or staff. He drove himself, unescorted, to a modest industrial warehouse on the outskirts of Cresswin. The security gate was rusted. The nameplate above the main office read Skytrans Logistics. Inside, men moved boxes. Forklifts hummed. Dust lingered in shafts of sunlight pouring through cracked glass. He asked for one name, Jaron Bell. It took a moment before Jaron emerged, tall, weathered, sleeves rolled past the elbow, hauling a pallet of emergency kits. His face held the weariness of someone who had been dismissed by an entire industry and had learned not to expect second chances. He didn't notice Darnell at first, not until he wiped his brow, looked up, and froze mid-step. "Mr. Voss," he said, stunned. Darnell approached, hand extended. "I heard you were here." Jaren set the pallet jack aside and took the handshake, unsure what to say. "They said I'd never work in the air again," he muttered. "Said I lacked the flexibility for protocol." Darnell nodded. "You refused to bait someone into public disgrace. That's not inflexibility. That's moral alignment." Jaren gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "I thought you'd forgotten." "I don't forget character," Darnell replied. For a moment, silence sat between them like a third voice. Then Darnell reached into his coat and handed Jaren a crisp document folder. On the front, Alteris Aviation. Inside, a formal offer. "Director of Passenger Integrity," Darnell said, watching Jaren's eyes scan the contents. "New department, new power, real oversight. You'll report directly to the board and to the passengers." Jaren's hands trembled slightly. "Why me?" "Because when they asked you to provoke me," Darnell said, "you walked away. Now I'm asking you to return and make sure no one else ever faces that choice alone." Emotion hit Jaren like delayed turbulence. He straightened his shoulders, nodded once, then twice, his voice low but steady. "I accept." They didn't shake hands again. They didn't need to. Later that evening, back at Crichton Systems, Darnell updated his response to the advisory board request. He would accept, but only after ensuring the foundation at Alteris was clean. As he typed, a line from weeks ago echoed back in his mind, spoken by a child seated in 1B. "Why are they mean to him, Daddy?" That voice had haunted him ever since. But tonight, a different voice joined it, one of resolve. Foreshadowing met its moment. He looked again at the signed acceptance letter from Jaren Bell. Integrity, once boxed in a warehouse, now had an office. Darnell closed the screen gently, stood, and whispered to the empty room. "You lost your job for doing what was right. Now it's time to make that right a job." The plastic clink of a juice cup tipping echoed through the cabin as orange liquid splashed down the tray, table, and over the edges onto the knees of a startled man in seat 12C. The child responsible, barely 5, with wide, tearful eyes, looked to his father with trembling lips. For one breathless second, the entire row seemed to hold still. Passengers glanced over, some expecting the kind of reaction they'd grown used to on flights. Sharp words, eye rolls, or worse. But the lead flight attendant, Midrow specialist Kevin Rorick, reacted with striking calm. "It's all right, sir," he said gently, already unhooking a sanitation pouch from the service panel. His voice was low, measured, and free of judgment. "We'll take care of it." He crouched quickly, blotting the floor, his tone soothing the father as much as the child. Two other crew members moved in near silently, one bringing fresh napkins, the other distracting the boy with a soft chuckle and a small pilot pin. From the back row, Jaren Bell watched with quiet intensity, jotting a note on his audit tablet. His badge, now reading Director, Passenger Integrity, caught the cabin light every time he adjusted his posture. He didn't smile, not quite, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a kind of reverence. This wasn't performative hospitality, it was change practiced. 10 rows forward, tucked discreetly into a window seat in economy. Darnell Voss observed in silence. No entourage, no fanfare, no briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, just a notepad in his lap, a soft gray jacket, and a mind attuned to nuance. The moment unfolded like a test written in real time, and it passed. The irony wasn't lost on him. This very airline, Alteris Aviation, had once orchestrated psychological stress tests under the guise of protocol. Now, under the charter he had pushed into existence, the real test was humility, kindness, humanity. A young attendant, barely out of training, passed by and paused. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Sir," he said quietly, leaning slightly so nearby passengers wouldn't hear, "it's an honor to have you fly with us." Darnell nodded once. No words. His reply lived in the steadiness of his gaze. The man moved on, leaving Darnell staring out the window where the clouds lay stretched like still oceans. In another world, this moment might have gone differently, mockery instead of compassion, escalation instead of empathy. He jotted another line in his notepad. Training may shape protocol, but character reveals itself in instinct. A turbulence warning chimed softly overhead. The seatbelt light blinked on, and then the real turbulence, the memory, returned. He remembered being told to kneel. He remembered the silence that followed, the sting of condescension coded as compliance. But today, the air felt lighter, the aisle cleaner, the language different. He noticed it everywhere. Not a single "sir" spoken with edge, not one delayed response to a request, not even a glance that held weight. Midway through the flight, the crew offered snacks. One man in row 10 declined politely, but coughed twice. Kevin didn't just walk past. He stopped, offered a bottle of water, and said, "Let me know if you feel dry again." It's easy to get dehydrated at altitude. Darnell tilted his head, impressed. These weren't lines from a manual. This was instinct reformatted by experience. Across the aisle, a teenager helped his grandfather plug in a headphone jack. No one snapped at them to hurry. Time felt patient. Cabin etiquette wasn't just policy, it was presence. Darnell's thoughts drifted to Jaron, seated just behind the action. The man who once lost his job for refusing to humiliate him now oversaw an entire dignity program. He had seen Jaron rehearse every new training module until midnight the week before. Not because he was told to, because he couldn't afford to let the standard fall. A gentle tap on his shoulder. It was Kevin again, offering him a cup of warm tea. It's peppermint. Helps with tension. No charge, of course. Darnell took the cup, the steam soft against his face. "Thank you," he said, finally speaking. "No," Kevin replied, his voice steady. "Thank you." Darnell returned to his seat. He didn't sip yet. He just held the warmth in his palms and watched the cabin, passengers reading, resting, whispering, living. He had spent decades writing policies. He'd issued reforms, filed lawsuits, survived humiliation. But none of it compared to this moment. Quiet, earned, dignified. And as the crew knelt again, not in apology, but in service to a spilled cup and a frightened child, Darnell realized this was how change arrived. Not loud, not forced, but repeated, trusted. That's what respect looks like in motion, Darnell thought. Not a statement, a standard. The headlines broke before dawn. Alteris ran psychological experiments on passengers. The morning bulletin blared as news anchors scrambled to unpack the findings of the Independent Commission's latest report. In quiet corners of the world, people refreshed their screens with a mix of outrage and disbelief. But inside a modest conference room tucked in a neutral government facility in Cresswin, Darnell Voss sat calmly, his elbows resting on the polished wooden table, eyes fixed on a digital report labeled Unauthorized In-Flight Conditioning Trials, Level 3 Findings. 32. That was the number the Commission had settled on. 32 separate experiments run under the radar by Alteris Aviation's internal compliance group, each aimed at high-profile passengers. And 5 of them had already surfaced publicly thanks to footage, whistleblowers, and the ripples of Darnell's audit. Each trial had followed a disturbing pattern: orchestrated provocations, psychological stressors, manufactured delays, and attempts to bait a reaction that would later be used to justify blacklisting or legal maneuvers. At the center of the report was a name Darnell expected but refused to speak aloud: Ryvan Dorn. The same Ryvan who had, not long ago, demanded that he kneel in a first-class aisle. Now disgraced, Ryvan had released a public statement just hours after the Commission's findings were unsealed. "I was used as a pawn," the statement read. "What I did was wrong, but I was following covert directives, rewarded for provoking certain passengers under unofficial metrics. I now see that I was expendable." Darnell read the words on his screen without emotion. "No divated. No press release. No counter-narrative." Silence was his only reply, but his mind was far from still. He turned to a leather-bound logbook on his right and added a single line beneath a page titled Final Entries, Compliance Files, Alteris Aviation. In careful, deliberate script, he wrote, "A system that chose arrogance over accountability." Just then, the door opened. Aaron Kale entered, a man whose loyalty had proven steel-willed across the ordeal. "Flight schools are asking for it," he said, sliding a document across the table. It was a request, formal, stamped, and signed by a coalition of national aviation training institutes. They want to include the Passenger Dignity Charter in their ethics curriculum, not just for crew, for management too. Darnell looked at the document for a long beat before nodding once. "Let them have it," he said softly. It was never written to stay in one cabin. Later that week, a small press meeting was held by an advocacy group representing passengers with disabilities, racial minorities, and trauma survivors. Darnell didn't attend. He didn't need to. Instead, he was across the city at a much quieter location, an old brick warehouse, now converted into a community legal hub. Inside, a group of volunteers was taking calls, many of them older men with steady voices and tired eyes. One of the volunteers was named Corwin, a former airline mechanic who had been forced into early retirement for refusing to falsify a report about a discriminatory delay. Another was Navin, once a gate agent, who had watched colleagues manipulate boarding orders to humiliate solo black fathers traveling with children. And there was Jaron Bell, the former flight attendant who had once refused to follow a script designed to provoke Darnell. Jaron approached Darnell with hesitation, holding a folder of call logs. "People are scared," he said, "not just of flying, of speaking up." Darnell nodded, then reached into his coat pocket and handed Jaron a card embossed with a silver seal. "Director of Passenger Integrity," it read beneath the Altiris insignia. Jaron stared at it. "You're serious?" "I told you," Darnell replied. "You lost your job for doing what was right. Now it's time to make that right a job." Across the room, a phone rang. Then another. Then 3 more. A wall monitor began displaying incoming messages. Delayed flights, seat targeting complaints, security, check misreporting. The hotline was live. Meanwhile, quietly and without media attention, Darnell directed funding into a new coalition of grassroots efforts, legal support teams, passenger watchdog groups, and mobile apps that allowed real-time reporting of in-flight discrimination. The technology wasn't flashy, but it worked. What had begun as a personal confrontation had evolved into a movement too large to erase. In the evening, as twilight framed the horizon in orange and silver, Darnell stepped out into the cold air and looked up. A plane soared overhead, its underbelly catching the last light of the day. He didn't know its destination, didn't need to, but he whispered just loud enough for the wind to carry it. "You don't change the skies," he often said, by shouting. "You change them by showing what silence failed to protect." The wheels had just begun rolling down the tarmac when Marcus turned to his godfather, eyes wide with curiosity. "Is this the same airline where they tried to embarrass you?" he asked in a hushed voice, as if the walls might still remember. Darnell Voss looked out the window briefly before answering, the engines humming just beneath his feet. "Same name," he said with a quiet nod. "Not the same place." He fastened his seatbelt and checked that Marcus had done the same. Across the aisle, a businessman peeked over his glasses, clearly recognizing Darnell, but too polite, or perhaps too intimidated, to say anything. The air carried that subtle blend of recycled oxygen and pre-flight nerves, but Darnell's presence added something else: awareness. The attendant arrived shortly after with a practiced smile, but the moment he saw Darnell, the smile deepened into something genuine. He was in his late 30s, clean-shaven, posture upright, uniform immaculate. "Mr. Voss," he said, pausing with reverence. "On behalf of the crew, it's an honor. Your example changed how I treat people every single day." Darnell stood slightly to shake his hand. "Then it was worth it," he replied, his voice calm but warm. The moment passed without ceremony, but its weight lingered like gravity redefined. As the aircraft lifted off, Marcus leaned closer. "Did it feel good?" he asked softly, almost conspiratorially. "To make that guy kneel?" Darnell turned to him, eyes steady. There was no anger left in his face, only reflection. "It wasn't about making him kneel," he said after a pause. "It was about standing up for everyone who couldn't." Marcus blinked, quiet now, his young mind wrestling with the answer. The boy had read the headlines, seen the clips, and overheard adults using words like humiliation, justice, and power move. But none of those words had landed the way Darnell's explanation just had. Outside, the clouds parted slowly, revealing a stretch of open sky. The light from the sun struck the wing at an angle, catching a soft gleam that danced across the window pane. Inside, the cabin buzzed with the usual chorus of clicks, seat adjustments, and overhead beeps, but none of it touched the stillness between the two passengers in 14A and 14B. Darnell pulled out a thin file from his coat pocket. It wasn't a legal document or a dossier on misconduct. It was a simple notebook, leather-bound, like the one he'd carried the day Ryvan Dorn challenged him. He flipped to a marked page where a quote he had once written to himself stared back in clean ink. Dignity isn't given. It's protected. The seatbelt sign chimed off. People began moving, stretching, resettling. But Darnell stayed still, one hand on the journal, the other resting gently on Marcus's shoulder. A few rows ahead, the lead attendant took a glance back, his eyes landing on Darnell again, not with fear, but with respect. The kind that wasn't forced, trained, or calculated. The kind that came from knowing someone had changed the game without ever raising their voice. Darnell didn't need announcements, applause, or interviews anymore. His story had become a standard. The Passenger Dignity Charter wasn't just a set of policies, it was a ripple effect, still expanding, still reaching people who didn't even know his name. Marcus leaned back in his seat, comforted. "So, you're not mad anymore?" "No," Darnell replied, eyes on the horizon. "I'm building something better than anger. I'm building memory." As the aircraft ascended into a patch of clear blue, the city far below faded into distance. What remained was this: a boy who had asked a question, a man who had lived the answer, in a cabin filled with quiet proof that change didn't always shout. It sometimes cruised quietly at 38,000 feet. And the man who was told to kneel became the reason others could finally stand. He demanded submission, and froze as the CEO made him kneel instead, every witness and camera capturing his downfall. If you believe dignity can reverse power in seconds, subscribe now, because justice always commands the room. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and justice in confronting prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every individual.